Today we're going to talk about CSS, Cascading Style Sheets. And I want to go through the things that most people find confusing. I think most of you understand that you can use style sheets to set body tags, styles for fonts, colors, things like that. Where I'm getting the most questions is when we get into where are we redefining tags, compound, ID, and classes. Because those are your four options in Dreamweaver. These are the ways you are generally going to apply your CSS styles. I frequently use all of them. The one that I think people have, we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up. The one that people most commonly have issues with is when is it a class and when is an ID. Because they work exactly the same way. You can use either a class or an ID, and the styles will apply the same way. The problem is when you need some other functions that are specific for the ID. So the questions you're going to have to ask yourself on class versus ID number one is one time per page. If it's only going to exist once per page, the ID is a good way to go. You can have that ID on multiple pages because typically your ID, we're going to use an external style sheet, and so you might have a header ID. That's fine. Each page can have a header. It can repeat in your site, but you wouldn't have two headers on the same page. Does that make sense? With a class, you're going to use it multiple places. So you might have, for a class, you might have a class fine print, legalese. You know, what the big print giveth, the small text taketh away. Has anybody heard that before? You always have to read the fine print. So something that you're going to use over and over again in multiple places on a page should be a class. So let's talk about things, and frequently the ID is the right way to go. The other thing that we use the ID for is when we're setting targets for our internal page links. Because if you have a link, you don't want two IDs. You can't link to two places on the page. Does that make sense? Well, you can. It won't work. It doesn't know which one to go to. I frequently will use a class for highlighting text, anything that's going to appear multiple times in a page. One of my favorite things to do is for images, I will usually have a right-align image and a left-align image where I'll set padding specifically and all the things so that I have it set where I want with the edge and the floats in there. So that's typically classes. Which would you choose, class or ID for breadcrumbs? Navigation. It would sort of depend, but typically ID, because I'm thinking if you have a navigation bar or a specific navigation section on the left or the right columns when it's a particular part. So if you have a section or article in your page, would you use, if you wanted to style an article differently, would you use an ID or a class? It sort of depends on how you're going to use it. So yeah, ID or class. So this is the big thing that once you get a grasp of that, it helps a lot. I think it's easier to understand how the ID is different once you get into really programming JavaScript. Because JavaScript, you frequently are programming to a specific ID to change something because an ID will uniquely identify something. So it's sort of like a variable in programming. And when you're programming in JavaScript, you want to make sure typically you're only hitting one thing, so they're very commonly used in JavaScript as well. Okay, so we also have, so ID is unique, class multiple times. Now, I find that you can use compound statements and classes interchangeably, and that's sort of a personal preference. Because a compound element can uniquely identify something, a class can sometimes be clearer. And the reason that I prefer classes over compound is because it's semantic. If you have a class called fine print, you know what you're using it for. If you have a class called highlighted text, you know what you're using it for. But if it's something that you're only using once and you don't really need to define semantically, sometimes I do use a compound. My common place where I use compound tags would be in something where I'm doing header and H1. Because typically, if I'm doing an H1 tag in my header, I'm going to want to center that. It's not worth it to me to write a whole class just for that. I just say if the H1 tag is in the header, it's centered. That doesn't center the rest of the page. Does that make sense? So you can further define a tag by where it sits in your page. That's your compound. It's this tag, but only when it's in the header. Does that make that clear how compound works? So you might have a bulleted list in the navigation, and typically if you have your page set up like this, which is a pretty standard layout, and your nav right here, often you'll use an unordered list for your navigation, and I typically prefer that to show without bullets. So I would define either by a class or by unordered lists in the nav bar that they would not have bullets on them. Make sense? So that one could go either way. Typically, if you could use a compound, you could use a class, and you have to think, does it make it more understandable if I create a class for this? And if it makes it clearer and more understandable, more semantic, generally you should do it. And then the other way to use CSS is to redefine tags. So you can redefine your paragraph tag where you set the font, you set the color. You can redefine an article tag. You can redefine the body tag or define it further to set background colors. So what we're doing is we're setting attributes on all of these. Does that make sense to everybody? Now this is where it gets a little tricky. There are 3 places to put CSS. And CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, because the rules sort of cascade. And this is interesting. I've been playing with it, and I understand it a little bit better every time I teach it. So, what are the 3 locations for your styles? Toss them out. You can have an external style sheet. Generally, this is the preferred way to do it, because you can apply it to 1 document or 1,000 documents. If you have a very large site, anything you do in an external style sheet will apply everywhere. This is where it gets very meaningful to have classes rather than defining something unique on each page, so that if it appears on any page, it gets redefined. What other 2 locations can we have for CSS? Internal, which is usually done in the header. This should be between the head tags. And I can think of a few reasons where you might want to use it here. Why would you want to use internal CSS over external?
It only applies to 1 page.
It only applies to 1 page, like you have a landing page. What's a landing page? Okay, a landing page. If you have a campaign, does anybody here watch Hulu? They've had a commercial on Hulu for a subscription for exercise videos. Has anybody seen that? And it tells you to go to their site /Hulu to get a special 30-day free trial. That's considered a landing page because it's specific for that advertising, because they know if you go to whatever site /Hulu, they can tell where you were guided from. So they know how successful their advertising on Hulu was. Does that make sense? Because if you come to the /Hulu page, you know that where all of those people were referred from, and you can tell, are those advertising dollars working for us? So if you're going to have a landing page with a different format, that can be good. Has anybody ever received, probably, email that's HTML formatted? If you're embedding it in an email page, it makes sense to put it with it. Or, like in Canvas, if I were to want to try to apply styles, doesn't work, by the way, in Canvas last time I tried. You can't do an internal one there, but that you can do. That's the sort of place that you would use it, is where you're doing a single sheet that you're either emailing to somebody, using for special purpose, or trying to override standard styles that the rest of the site is using. What's the last place? Very good. I was going to say, like rollerblades. Inline. Typically done with a span, but it could also be applied to a paragraph or any other element. You can do a style on those. This is what I would use if I was doing styling in Canvas or inside of some other application where I really couldn't point it to an external style sheet. That's about the only place that I found that an inline style is a way to be preferred, is if you're working inside of another application. Like in, you can use inline styles inside of content management systems. Now this is confusing because sometimes, now with a cascading style sheet, you can occasionally have multiple styles and have a hard time knowing which one's going to win. So let's say that we have an HTML document. Pretend with me because I'm not going into the full formatting here. We have our head section. And we have a link. And we have styles. This is the way you should do this. You should have your external style sheet first and your internal style sheet second. Why?
Because it's cascading, and
Whichever.
it's going to use the top one first.
It's going to use the closest one first. So if these two are in a fight, whichever one's listed second wins. So typically your external style sheet is going to be styling the whole site. The internal style sheet is overriding for the current page. And it's the nearer one that wins. So if you're doing this with the intent of overriding your external style sheets, make sure it comes second. Otherwise, if both of them define H1, and in this one H1 is blue, and in the internal style sheet H1 is green, this will override that because it's nearer. It's whichever one's nearer to the code. So that's something that can mess you up if you don't realize it. So if you're using both external and internal, make sure that the on-page styles come after the link to your external page, and then it'll work the way you expect it to. Any questions on any of that? There are two ways to make a style win if you don't know where it's going to be. Well, one way to make it win. There's another way that will always override. How can you make your style win if you put them in the wrong order? And it's really important. That was my hint, by the way. And I only really expect one person in the class to know this because he's seen it in a test in the other class he took. How do you make a style win? When it's important. That's your hint.
Oh, mark it important.
Yeah, you mark it important. I think there's the... And you can Google the exact format, but it's an exclamation mark and the word important, and that makes it win. The other style that always wins, sometimes people have their own user-defined style sheets in their browser. If it's the user's personal computer, their preferences, they're always the closest, they always win, because if a user sets it up, it's usually because they have vision problems, and the user's preferences should always override only on their computer. It won't impact the way anybody else sees it, but if a user has their own custom style sheet, it will win. How many of you have your own custom style sheet? Yeah, it's not something people do very often, but it is something you can do, and people with severe vision problems will sometimes do that to make it easier to see things. They'll override and make all the fonts larger. Does that make sense why people might do that? All right, so from this point forward in the course, the only thing we're going to use tables for is data, and not the android from Star Trek. And if you don't catch that reference, don't tell me. I feel old enough. So we're going to be focusing on using style sheets. Can you use internal style sheets? Yes, on individual labs, but for your projects, I want all style sheets to be external because it is best practices, because that way you have everything in one spot And it's way easier if you need to make a change to go back and find it. So if you have a 100-page site, which is really easy to do, and your customer says, we have a new logo, we want to change all our colors. You don't have to go into any of the 100 pages. You go into one CSS page and you drop in the new colors where they want it, and you're done in about 10 minutes. That's the real power of style sheets. Plus, it gives you complete and total precision, whereas tables, you can do cool things, but CSS is more precise.